And we're going to continue on again. I've taken some little breaks here. Now we're going to look, as we say, we saw this decline in the industrial index and the decline in real GDP in the United States, a much smaller decline in the UK. Let's take a look at some other countries and see what happened. And this, and the best way to do it with data at the time, that at that time there was not good data on GDP in many countries. The UK, as I noted, had good data. The US was just the real GDP data was only just got started in 1929. That there was data in order to come up with the national accounts in order to do that. So let's see what happened in other countries to make a comparison. And again, we're going to make the same comparison with the Great Recession. We'll look at that later. And one of the things we can see right away is the United States was probably the most severe, had the most severe decline of all the countries, industrial countries in the world. From peak to trough decline in industrial production, we saw that there was a decline in GDP of nearly 30%. There was a more than 45% decline, about a 46, nearly 47% decline in industrial production from peak to trough in the United States. Similar, the only country that had as great a decline was Poland in Eastern Europe. Canada was somewhat similar to the United States. Canada being very close, a neighbor, the northern neighbor of the United States. Canada and its economy even back then was fairly tied in with the United States. That Canada experienced declines that were not dissimilar, almost not quite as much from peak to trough decline in industrial production. Germany experienced a tremendous decline as well, of more than 40% in industrial production. What's interesting to note there is that that decline, in fact, would lead to a decline. That would lead to a decline. Let me just get this started here. That would lead to a decline, the rise of decline of democracy and the rise of Adolf Hitler as a result of that. This decline. So this had an ominous impact on the world as a result of what went on in Germany in the early 1930s. The Netherlands had a decline of more than 35%. France and Belgium, other Western Central European countries, had a decline of about 30%. So we see these the northern Western Central European economies, Netherlands, France, Belgium, and Germany, with 30 to 40% declines. Other European countries such as Denmark and also noted the UK. And the UK had less of a decline. Denmark and the UK about 16% or so. And northern European countries, Sweden, even less, only about a 10% decline in industrial production. Argentina, example of a South American country, data is available there, and a decline of about 17% in industrial production. Brazil, another South American country, only saw a decline of about 7%. So not really a significant effect of the decline. In Japan, it's very interesting to note, only about less than 9% decline in industrial production in Japan from its peak. So Japan actually was relatively little touched. For everything else, what went on in Japan in the 1930s in terms of political and military impacts, there was not much of an economic the decline. The decline in the economy was not transmitted. And one of the things that this suggests is that these economies may have had less ties with the United States. Argentina, Denmark, the UK, Japan, less important, significant ties with the United States. It's important to remember that that compared to the pre-1914, as I've noted in previous lectures, there had already been a significant decline in global trade anyway, and trade decline as a result of the Great Depression, and countries like Japan, which did not have a lot of trade with the West, Western democracies at that time, would not have experienced. It's not surprising that it didn't experience as great of a decline, and this would probably be the case for Brazil as well. Brazil, at the time, an underdeveloped economy, and in somewhat of a far-off corner of the world, and certainly at the time quite distant to the United States. So again, it's not terribly surprising that there was less of an impact. The world was just less integrated than it is now. Dr. Romer notes that the severity of the Great Depression was increased by several policy errors. Probably the most important was that the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates and reduced the money supply in 1931. This was something that would be unheard of now. No central bank during a major downturn would do something as silly as raising interest rates and reducing the money supply. Now, as what we've seen in the recent Great Recession, a reduction in interest rates, in fact, an unprecedented reduction in interest rates, and an unprecedented expansion in the money supply. So what happened during the Great Depression was the opposite. The U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates and reduced the money supply. This was in response to the UK, the United Kingdom, going off of the gold standard in 1931. We've talked we talked a bit about the gold standard in this class. I did talk more about it in the previous semester. The gold standard, just very briefly, the world was on a standard where currency exchanges and currency exchange rates were fixed to the value of gold, and so since they were currencies were fixed to the value of gold, and all currencies were pegged, all major currencies were pegged to the value of the gold, then currencies, and most currencies in the world of major countries were fixed to each other. So as a result, and this stayed in place from 1880 till the beginning of World War I. After World War I, the United Kingdom went back on the gold standard. The U.S. was continuously on the gold standard. The U.S. never went off the gold standard until the early 1930s, as a result of the Great Depression. But the UK decided to leave the gold standard and put its currency adopt a floating exchange rate. The Federal Reserve feared that there would be a run on gold held by the United States as a result of the UK leaving the gold standard. There was a worry that gold would flow from the U.S. to the United Kingdom. And so, as a result, the U.S. Federal Reserve, because of that fear, raised interest rates and reduced the money supply. But it was a dramatically inappropriate monetary contraction during a downturn. That is something that probably had a significant impact on making the recession, the Depression, even worse, much worse than than it was, and it was a terrible recession, a depression to begin with, but that probably made it even that much worse in the United States. Of secondary concern was the effect of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Now the interesting thing this was that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 in the United States, the U.S. raised tariffs on nearly 900 products as a result of this tariff act that was passed by the U.S. Congress actually around the time that the stock market collapsed and signed into law by then President Herbert Hoover in early 1930. The fact is that as many economists now note, that it did cause trade to decline because many U.S. trading partners responded to the increase in tariffs by raising their own tariffs, and so the increase in tariffs made trading in goods less attractive. So since it was less, so it raised the price of traded goods. So there was a reduction in trade, and quite possibly because there was a reduction in trade that the economic downturn was made worse. Although now most economists believe that because there was much less global trade anyway, and that the amount of trade that the U.S. had with the rest of the world at that time was a relatively small percentage of GDP. I think the figure I've seen is about 7% of GDP. So the decline in trade as a result of the tariffs probably didn't have a significant impact on the contraction of GDP in the United States during that period. Very likely, this policy by the U.S. Federal Reserve had a greater impact in 1931, and in the end, the decline in spending, the collapse of the banking system in the United States, which in turn was made worse by the lack of deposit insurance, were probably had a greater impact on making the Depression worse. And that's the end of this lecture. It's a little bit shorter, but I'm gonna stop there. I may add more a little bit later, but I'll get back to you if I do that. I'm going to post this now, and then we'll see what if I'll add any more later. I'll be in touch with you on that. Thanks. Thank you.